gone into bankruptcy early on, if Susan had left, we would not have only 50% of the obligation, we would have 100% of the obligation.
But why was it that the McDougalls lost so much more money than you did? I don't understand.
I can't answer that. I mean, we gave whatever money we were requested to give by Jim McDougal. I mean, he was the one who would say, here's what you owe on interest, here's what your contribution should be. We did whatever he asked us. We saw no records, we saw no documents. He was someone that my husband had known a very long time. He was someone who had been in real estate business with many people we knew, including Senator Fulbright, and we just assumed that whatever he needed, he would ask for, and we didn't have any information to the contrary.
Given that you were jointly and severally liable for all the debt, and that you and your husband are both lawyers, that you would be so passive about a fairly substantial investment?
We were not real estate developers, and Jim had a track record, and I wasn't a cattle expert. I trusted Jim Blair, and it worked out for me, and I wasn't a real estate expert, and we lost money. Those things happen. Yes. Yes.
To get back to Linda's earlier question, one of the things that has been driving this is either the lack of explanations or the shifting explanations. And in terms of the way that your commodities trading was first described, that you did the trades, you relied on some advice from Mr. Blair. Later it was revealed that Mr. Blair placed most of the trades, if not all of them. Can you explain what happened? Did you have a new recollection?
No.
Why the shift?
Well, if you just listen to what you said, I did the trades. They were my trades. I was responsible for them. But I did them on the advice of Jim Blair, and very often he placed them for me. I'm not in any way excusing any confusion that we have created. I think we have created it because I don't think that we gave enough time or focused enough. You know, I have been traveling, and I'm more committed to health care than anything else I do. I probably did not spend enough time, get as precise. Different people heard different things that I said, or by the time it got passed to the third or fourth person, or one member of the press would call somebody in the White House, but somebody else would call another person. So I think that the confusion was our responsibility. We did not give you a focused place to come, and we did not spend the time necessary. There's not really a contradiction in what you said and what I said, but I can understand how somebody might assume that.
Confusions. I'll ask you about one other
Yes.
thing that I've had problems with. During the campaign, I think it was right after the primary debate between Jerry Brown and your husband, you made a statement in, I think, a Chicago restaurant that you never did any regulatory work for Madison Guarantee. When the letter went to Beverly Bassett Schaefer about perhaps the legality of offering preferred stock, your name was at the bottom of that letter.
Right.
Could you explain that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, because that's another thing that I feel has gotten quite confused in the telling. And let me just try to describe what happened there. When in 1985, I believe, maybe 86, there was an effort made on the part of various financial institutions around the country to increase their capital net worth. They began looking for ways to do that. There was a very bright young associate in our law firm who had a relationship with one of the officers at Madison, a young man whom he had known. They began talking, and if you'll remember what happened when the S&Ls were deregulated, many states were left wholly unprepared. They did not have a regulatory system in place. They didn't even really have good laws. And all of a sudden, there was no federal regulation to speak of, and so people were asking state governments whether things could be done. Those two young men thought that it would be legal under Arkansas law for a savings and loan to issue preferred stock, but there was absolutely no law on that, and so they couldn't be sure. But they decided that what they wanted to do was to ask the person who regulated savings and loans whether it was legal. Not if Madison could do it. That was the second step. The first step is, could you even do it in Arkansas, whether you were A, B, or C, not just Madison? When they talked about doing that, the young, his backstop, and that was one of the rules we had in our firm. he knew that I knew Jim McDougall. He also knew that Jim had been a client of our firm in the past. This was not a new representation. So he came to me and asked me if I would talk with Jim to see whether or not Jim would let the lawyer and the officer go forward on this project. I did that, and I arranged that the firm would be paid a $2,000 a month retainer. And that was ordinary and customary. That would be billed against, unlike retainers of some really big law firms that if you pay the retainer, they keep it no matter whether they do any work for you. This was really an advance against billing. That was arranged. The young attorney, the young bank officer did all the work. And the letter was sent, but because I was what you call the billing attorney, in other words, I had to send the bill to get the payment made, my name was put on the bottom of the letter. It was not an area that I practiced in. It was not an area that I really know anything to speak of about. At that point, the regulatory authorities, namely Beverly Bassett Schaefer, answered the legal question. And the legal question was, yes, it is permissible under Arkansas law to issue this preferred stock. Then the question moved on to the second phase, in which I had no involvement that I have any memory of or anyone that I've talked with. That was trying to determine whether Madison could go forward. And I think that the Securities Commissioner acted absolutely appropriately. She answered the legal question. Yes, it is legal to do this. But as to Madison, she laid out conditions that had to be met for Madison to do it, and Madison could never meet those conditions, and so they never issued preferred stock. So the legal question was answered, but Madison got no benefit at all from the answer of that legal question. Yes, Mike?
Can you clarify for us what documents were removed from Vince Foster's office after he died and why they were there in the first place?
Well, Mike, I can tell you what I know, which is that I did not know that Vince had any of the documents related to our personal business in his office until after his death. What I believe he was doing with them was serving as a coordinator among our private lawyers and accountants and certain government officials like the Office of Government Ethics with respect primarily to our blind trust, because there were all these questions that had to be answered, and he was kind of the coordinator. The private lawyers would talk to him, and the Office of Government Ethics people would talk to him. I think that's why he had any documents of a personal nature in his office at the time of his death.
As a follow-up, why did your chief of staff, Maggie Williams, why was she among those who removed the documents from his office within a day of his death?
I don't think that she did remove any documents. I think that what happened is that after Mr. Nussbaum reviewed the documents, and after he did so, as I recall, I was not here, I was in Arkansas, but I believe that that was done in the presence of officials from the Park Police and maybe some other agencies. Then Mr. Nussbaum distributed the files according to whom he thought should have them. There were files related to ongoing work in the counsel's office that needed to be passed on to other lawyers. There were personal files of Vince's that needed to go to his family. And there were these personal files of ours that went to our lawyer. Yes?
I'm wondering, another question about this rezoning of private and public lives. I'm wondering what kind of a toll, if any, this has taken on you and the president's personal and political lives, and do you ever look in the mirror and wish that you just never got into this?
No, never, never. I mean, some days are better than other days, but, you know, I think what has helped me in the last couple of weeks, aside from some good friends who have talked with me and helped me get rezoned, if you will, is my belief that this is really a result of our inexperience in Washington, if you will, that I really did not fully understand everything that I wish now I had known. And, you know, it's a learning experience. Sometimes a difficult one, but I think one that both the President and I are anxious to do, because we think that the reason he was elected was to deal with the big issues that we want the country to deal with. And so it is a little disappointing if we in any way contribute to a diversion from that. And, you know, that's something that I don't want to have happen in the future. And I'm certainly going to try to be more sensitive to what you all need and what we need to give you, and do it in a more efficient and effective way the first time. Because, as I said earlier, I feel very confident about how this will all turn out. This is not a long-term problem or issue in any way. But I don't want anybody to have the wrong impressions of either of us, and I don't want anything to interfere with doing what the people of this country need done.
You've spoken of the politics of personal destruction. Who do you believe are the main perpetrators of that?
I don't want to get into that. I don't think that bears any real useful discussion. I think that what's important is for us, not just the President and me, but the entire administration, to keep focused on what really will stand the test of history and what we really are trying to do for the country. And I can't really help it if some people get up every day wanting to destroy instead of build, or wanting to undermine. That's something that I try not to think about or dwell on, and try to do what I'm expected to do, which for me is working on health care. How does my husband ever make these choices? These are hard choices. Okay, go ahead.
When was your last conversation with Vince Foster, and what was your understanding of the state of his mind?
You know, I've thought about that so many times. I don't think I had any conversation with him for at least 3 weeks before he died, because, you know, we left for Tokyo somewhere around the 4th of July, is my best memory. And for about a week before that, I was very preoccupied with getting ready for the trip and doing the things you have to do. So I don't have any memory of having talked to Vince, and I never talked to him during the time that I was gone. And like every one of our friends, you know, we've relived everything that happened or didn't happen. The people who talked to him, the people who spent time with him, they question whether they said the right thing or whether they could have done something else. The fact that I didn't talk to him makes me wonder whether if I had called him, I could have picked up a clue. I just don't have any way of knowing.
Supposedly he had been in depression, or so we're told, for a considerable period of time. Were you ever aware of that? And do you have any clue what was going on?
No, and neither did people who, you know, spent the weekend with him or saw him in the office that day. You know, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing in the last months is trying to educate myself about depression, and my good friend Tipper Gore has been a great help on that, as have the people she's worked with on mental health issues. And I just hope that we get over the stigma that is still often attached to people admitting they need help, or that they can't understand what's happening to them. I have no doubt now, in retrospect, and many of my friends now can reconstruct conversations or things they saw in Vince in those last weeks, but they didn't know, they didn't understand, and he didn't either feel comfortable or know himself. And so maybe out of all of this tragedy and the aftermath, all of the speculation, maybe once we put to rest once and for all the fact that he committed suicide and that it was a tragic loss of one of the best people we've ever known, maybe it can do something to help other people understand what depression can do to you. Yes.
What was your personal reaction when you learned that Jay Stevens would be representing the RTC in a case against Madison?
My personal reaction?
How did you feel about the fairness of that decision by the RTC to hire him?
Well, I didn't understand it, you know, but I don't know Mr. Stevens, and I assume he will be a very fair and judicious lawyer. I guess that's what I would expect.
You're not concerned about his being a Republican appointee and a U.S. attorney appointed by President Bush?
Not if he abides by the code of professional ethics and does his job professionally. I'm not, and you all keep an eye on him. Ann?
Do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, that it was improper for you and your law firm to represent the
federal government against a family friend, Dan Lassiter, and against accountants from Madison S&L without fully disclosing that you had been business partners with Mr. McDougal?
Well, Ann, I don't know what was disclosed and what wasn't. Those were not my cases. Those were cases that came to the firm to other lawyers. I've been told that things were disclosed quite extensively. And certainly in Arkansas, most things are known. And the relationship with Mr. McDougal, the fact that Mr. Lassiter made campaign contributions to my husband was certainly well known. In both of those instances, I don't think I had anything to do at all with the representation against Madison on behalf of the federal government. At least I have absolutely no memory of having done anything on that case. With respect to the Lassiter case, I think out of that entire case, I worked 2 hours as a favor to one of the lawyers who was out of town who asked me to review a pleading. And I have specifically inquired whether there was any ethical conflict with respect to that, and have been assured there was not. He was not a client that we had any obligation to. Thousands and thousands of people contributed to my husband. That is not considered disqualification. We were not personal friends or social friends. So I don't see any basis for saying that my work for him as limited, or against him as limited as it was, amounted to any kind of conflict.
Mrs. Clinton?
Yes.
The real thundering cry for you to be in this conference was 4 to 6 weeks ago, and Whitewater subsided off the front page in the past couple of weeks. Why today? What's changed in the past couple of days that has made you want to come out here?
Nothing changed really, except I said Helen spoke, so I heard that. But I just, maybe I'm slow in kind of picking up subtle and not so subtle messages, but for me it was an evolutionary process. I mean, I really did, and I see now how mistaken I was, but I really did believe that every time I went anywhere in the country, I would have press availabilities. I would always answer the press's questions. Sometimes they'd have to wait. Linda had to wait a long time when I finished doing local interviews and radio interviews in St. Louis, and some of the others of you have been in Barnes with me and other places like that. You sometimes have to wait, but I always said, are there any questions from the press? And sometimes I'd be asked a Whitewater question, sometimes not. Every time I did satellite feeds to local TV stations, I'd answer the questions. So I really was under the misimpression that if I answered them in Rochester or I answered them in St. Louis or somewhere else, that should be enough. And I just didn't understand enough about being accessible to all of you or being accessible in Washington. And so I came to that realization, and that's why I'm here. Yes.
It's not just the press that has questions about something. Sometimes American citizens who talk to your husband at town meetings and all. And one young woman in Charlotte asked him a question I'd like to pose to you. She said that in the recent news reports about the First Lady's cattle future earnings and with all these Whitewater allegations, many of us Americans are having a hard time with your credibility. How can you earn our trust back? Is there a fundamental distrust of the Clintons in America?
Well, I hope not. I mean, that would be something that I would regret very much. I do think that we are transition figures, if you will. We don't fit easily into a lot of our pre-existing categories. And let me speak just about myself. I came to this role having worked my entire life. I mean, I started working in the summers when I was 13. I always worked. I worked through college. I worked through law school. That's what I did. And after I married, I continued to work. And after my daughter was born, with the exception of the 4 months I took off for maternity leave, I worked. Now, I took time off from work to do volunteer work. Like I took long time off from my law firm work to work on education reform, or I would take time off to work on my husband's campaigns, or I would be in Washington on the Children's Defense Fund. I would certainly take a lot of time, but I was fundamentally working. And I think that having been independent, having made decisions, it's a little difficult for us as a country maybe to make the transition of having a woman like many of the women in this room sitting in this house. So I think that the standards and to some extent the expectations and the demands have changed, and I'm trying to find my way through it and trying to figure out how best to be true to myself and how to fulfill my responsibilities to my husband and my daughter and the country. So I do think that there is some of that. And then additionally, as I have said earlier, I think that my fundamental belief in privacy and my feeling that we were being asked things and demands were being placed on us that had never been demanded of prior inhabitants of this house, unprecedented in Arthur Schlesinger's words, didn't make sense to me. I couldn't quite figure it out, and I resisted that. And I think I resisted it in ways that may have raised more questions than they answered, and I just don't think that was a very useful road for me to go down, and I'm trying now to better understand how to fit my personal needs and my own personal beliefs and what I want to do with this role for the country and the contribution I want to make into a broader context so that I can be as forthcoming and accessible as you need me to be.
Mrs. Clinton,
yes.
On the subject of health care reform, two of the most controversial elements of the White House plan is the employer mandate and the mandatory health alliances. Do those two elements absolutely have to be in a final package in order for the president to sign it?
Well, you know, the president has made clear for many months that the bottom line is guaranteed insurance coverage for every American, sometimes called universal coverage. And that really is the bottom line. Now, there isn't any way that we can think of to get there without either raising taxes or having some combination of employer and employee contribution. And we favor the employer-employee contribution. We think that is fairer, it is more familiar to Americans, it is how we now get our insurance. So we believe that the employer-employee responsibility is the right way to go. Now, if the Congress, as it is now doing, is looking at alternatives, comes up with another way to do it that they believe will work and can get a majority, we're certainly going to look at that. And the reason behind the alliances is to pool purchasing power among all of us, small business people and families, farmers, everybody, so that we can get the lowest possible cost for insurance. But it is also to ensure that everybody gets the same affordable health care. It's what's called community rating, and we want to be sure that we can enforce community rating. Again, if the Congress has a different way of doing it, we are going to be open and responsive to that. But those are the functions we want to perform. Financing universal coverage fairly and affordably, and making sure that community rating is in place.
Suggested a broad-based tax as one means of funding health care reform beyond just the employer contribution alone. What would the White House view be of that?
We're not going to comment on the congressional process while it's going on. We're encouraging every committee to be as careful and innovative as they can be to come up with solutions to the health care crisis. So we want the Congress to work. Yes, yes.
Federal regulators have noted that in the mid-1980s, when Whitewater wasn't generating much in the way of income, the mortgage, and you folks weren't putting too much money in, the mortgage still was paid, and the question was raised in a memo from one regulator to her boss. Shouldn't they have wondered? Shouldn't they have known? Can you take us through your thought processes or contacts with the McDougals on Whitewater during that period of time?
Well, I really don't have anything to add specifically to that because I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. As far as I know, Madison always made its required regulatory reports, and as far as I know, we always put in whatever money we were requested to put in. One of the reasons why I'm now glad we have a special counsel is that I think we will once and for all, whenever he issues his report, know exactly what everybody did, and I can't speak for anybody else besides my husband and me.
Do you expect to give testimony to Congress or to the grand jury or anything on your activities in Whitewater?
I don't know, but we will fully cooperate as appropriate with whatever we're requested to do. Yes.
One of the things that Congress will be looking at when it begins the hearing, and one of the first reports expected out of the special prosecutor, is the possibility of any evidence leading toward obstruction of justice. Can you tell us what your Chief of Staff, Margaret Williams, and your Press Secretary, Lisa Caputo, told you back in the fall, and what you told them about the meetings with federal regulators?
Nothing, and I don't know what their testimony is, so I can't comment on that.
Is there any reason for any evidence whatsoever to lead anyone to suspect there's any obstruction of justice involved, or that the White House said anything that would lead the people to call off their investigation or to think about it?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Yes. Mrs. Clinton, can you tell us what you know about stories about shredding of Whitewater documents down in Arkansas?
Nothing.
Particularly at the gubernatorial mansion?
Oh, that didn't happen, and I know nothing about any other such stories.
You know nothing about documents relating to Whitewater ever shredded anywhere that you know about or authorized or didn't authorize?
Absolutely not. Yes.
Ms. Clinton, following up on the RTC question, the memorandum quoted in the New York Times from the investigator in Kansas City says that Mr. McDougal kited checks and that the funds benefited Whitewater partners who knew that Whitewater was not cash flowing and that notes or mortgages still were being paid. Congressman Leach still says that he's convinced, he has no doubt whatsoever, that dollars were diverted from Madison into Whitewater and used to pay the personal loans of the then governor, of Mr. Clinton. Are you convinced that no monies from Mr. McDougal or any of his related companies paid any obligations of yours or your husband's?
I know of nothing to support that, and I think we should wait and see what all the facts are, because, I just want to reiterate that we didn't even see any documents until late in the 1980s, probably late 88 or 89. And so I just don't have any way of telling you what went on from 78 to 88 or 89. Now, I think we ought to wait until somebody who is a credible fact finder, like the special counsel, looks at everything and tells all of us at the same time what happened when, because we don't have any independent information to provide.
If I could follow up, the suggestion in the RTC memorandum is that the investors, presumably including you and your husband, knew or should have known that Whitewater was not cash flowing and that notes or debts should have been paid, whether Mr. McDougal asked you to pay them or not.
Well, shoulda, coulda, woulda, we didn't. And the only thing I can say to that is when I was asked in late 88 or early 89 by the realtor who handled the sales in North Arkansas to help him, because neither Jim nor Susan McDougal were available any longer. We tried as best we could to do things like pay the taxes, and when owners of lots didn't fulfill their obligations, to try to resell the property, things that were largely administrative at that point in time. And the fact is that by 1992, the loan was paid off. So I really don't know what that means. Yes?
Given what you've been through, do you have any greater appreciation of what Richard Nixon might have been going through back in '74? And what are your thoughts about him? How do you think history will judge him?
Oh, I don't know that it's time to start talking like that yet. I think that what I think we ought to be doing is praying for President Nixon. And, from my perspective, it was a year ago, April, that my father died at the age of 81. And so, I'm just mostly thinking about his daughters right now.
One last question.
Who hasn't had one? Yes.
You have said that when you were at the Rose Law Firm, you didn't share in any of the profits that the firm earned from its representation of state agencies. When did you begin that practice, and did that also include any profits from the firms facilitating the sale of bonds with the Arkansas Development and Finance Authority?
I don't remember the exact year, but I made the decision not to share in the profits around the time I became a partner from any representation of state agencies, anything that could be considered tax money. For a couple of years, I did share in the benefits from bond underwriting. And then I decided I shouldn't even do that, so I paid the firm back. And from that point in time, I did not share in either fees from state agencies or fees generated by any kind of bond underwriting at all.
And did you have any part of the $2,000 a month retainer? Did you share in that, in any of that?
You know, I might have to a very minimal amount for whatever little bit I did on that. But at the end of about a year, I believe, we were no longer representing Madison because, as I explained, they were not going to get to issue preferred stock. They could not do it because of the conditions that Beverly Bassett Schaefer had imposed. So, in fact, we returned money to Madison. I remember writing and signing the letter to Jim McDougall saying, you know, we have fulfilled the work we have done for you. We are still holding some of your retainer. There doesn't appear to be any continuing work to be billed against it, so I sent him a check back. So,
remaining confusion about the commodity
Yes, Mary.
Mrs. Clinton, how would you account for the decline in the support of the Clinton health plan? Do you think that the suspicions and questions which have come out of these matters has spilled over on that and affected people's ideas about just how honestly and efficiently government can deal with life and death?
Mary, I think that's a real important question. I do believe that some of the opponents of health care have certainly tried to use Whitewater as a proxy for their opposition to health care. I think that in the last several days, some of the leading opponents of health care have even said things which seem to suggest that. I find that very regrettable. I mean, if someone wants to argue about the future of health care in our country, I think the debate ought to be about health care, and I have absolutely no problem with someone saying, I don't like alliances, or I think we ought to have a different benefits package. That's what I believe democratic debate ought to be about. But I do think that some have tried to use this to undermine support for health care. On the other hand, there has been continuing concern about the health care plan. If you go back and look at the very first time it was introduced back in the fall, because this is a big issue, and I think people want to be sure we get it right. But every time you ask the specific questions about what is it people want, I think you can get a pretty good idea of where they want us to go. I mean, people do want health security, and they do want guaranteed benefits. And the big majority of Americans think the right way to do it is through the workplace with employer-employee contributions. And I think people want Medicare preserved and improved with prescription drugs and long-term care. And they certainly want to outlaw the insurance practices that discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions and impose lifetime limits. And they want to preserve choice of doctor and choice of health plan. So if you take the elements of the president's plan, and if you look at the polling data that I have, you sometimes get these contradictory results where if you say to people, do you support the president's plan, they think about the last ad they've seen, or maybe they've gotten one of these incredible direct mail letters that, you know, the sky is falling. It's really just stuff that's been recycled from the fight against Medicare, just new names and new addresses. But when you get to the specifics, there are majorities of Americans for most of the specifics. And I think that's what the Congress is sorting out right now. So I'm not surprised, and I'm not in any way concerned that we're at this point in the process. I think this is where we would likely be as we're dealing with one of the most important social issues in our country's history. So, thank you very much. Well, you know what? You know, let me say, one of the things that I didn't mention that influenced me is a friend of mine gave me a thesis the other day. Gosh, I think it was like Tuesday or Wednesday about Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. She had 340 press conferences, right? 340 press conferences during the time.
You're my 10th First Lady.
I think, yeah, it sounds like fun.
This is the most important thing you could do for the press.
Hillary Rodham Clinton, referring to Eleanor Roosevelt and more than 300 news conferences, although this is certainly unique in contemporary American history. The last several First Ladies have not held news conferences. This is very reminiscent of the situation with Geraldine Ferraro when she was the vice presidential candidate on the Walter Mondale ticket, in which she was forced to call a lengthy news conference to explain her family's personal finances. Hillary Rodham Clinton today summoned the White House press to, as you could see, that meeting in the Lincoln Room at the White House. And she was cool, articulate, and for the most part, very responsive to all questions, not only about Whitewater, but about her personal trading in two different stock accounts, one a commodities trading account, the other one was a discretionary account that she opened with a local brokerage in Little Rock, Arkansas. She also talked about Vincent Foster, what may have been in his office, about her last conversation with him, which she thought was some 3 weeks before he committed suicide. And she said she thought that this too shall pass, that the presidency ultimately will not be damaged by it, although she did agree with Mary McRory that it probably was having some impact now on the attempts of the Clinton administration to get a national health care plan passed before this fall. Someone who has been watching the Whitewater developments very carefully and covers Capitol Hill for us is standing by now in our Washington studios, Lisa Myers. Lisa, any major errors on the part of Mrs. Clinton so far as you could tell?
No, not a one. It was entirely consistent with what the White House has said before in terms of her explanations or her latest explanations about various events. There were a couple of new facts. One involving the issue of margin calls. Margin calls, for those not involved in the commodities markets, are times when your account falls below the balance necessary to continue trading, and your broker will call you up and say, look, if you want to stay in the market, you need to come up with $5,000 or some amount in the next 24 hours. She indicated that during the entire time she traded, she did not get any call from her broker, even though her statements indicated that at least twice she should have had to put money into her account to meet the margins. Now, she insisted that was not favoritism, that perhaps her broker didn't want to get involved in the paperwork. However, most involved in the commodity market who have had to meet a margin call would consider that a very sweet deal. Mrs. Clinton did note correctly, however, that the fact that she was not asked to make those calls was not her fault. It was a lapse on the part of her broker, Tom.
All right, thank you very much, Lisa Myers. Let's get the view from the White House now. NBC's Andrea Mitchell is standing by there. And Andrea, your quick assessment of the performance and the answers of Mrs. Clinton this afternoon?
Well, she didn't answer all of the questions. There were some things she said she did not have answers for, but it was really an unprecedented, extraordinary performance. I think you saw the talent of Hillary Rodham Clinton as a politician, and she did admit to mistakes. She said that they had, in one sense, made a political mistake, not being more forthcoming. She blamed herself for opposing the special prosecutor, for instance, Tom, and for not being more forthcoming earlier on.
All right, thank you very much, Andrea Mitchell. The White House will have a complete wrap-up, of course, on all of this tonight on NBC Nightly News. We want to tell you as well.
This Clinton's news conference at the White House answering reporters' questions mostly about the Whitewater affair and her trades in the commodities markets back 14 years ago. CNN's White House correspondent Jill Doherty standing by now at the White House. Jill, you were in the room with the First Lady. This was an extraordinary event.
Well, it was, Judy, and it reminded me very much, I think Bill was mentioning the Ferraro press conference a number of years ago, and at that time I was covering Ferraro for a while for CNN and was in that room for that very press conference, and there was somewhat the same feeling, although the setting here was deliberately very informal. She was sitting, Mrs. Clinton was sitting in front of a fireplace. She was dressed in pink, a very warm color, and there was an informality which, as some people have been saying now, she carried off very well. There were also a lot of kind of mea culpas sprinkled throughout this. Her admission that much of this had been caused by their lack of knowledge about Washington and how things work here. And then also, we have a couple of bites coming up, one of them in which Mrs. Clinton talked about her background and her upbringing and how that led her to perhaps inadvertently create the impression of hiding something.
I think that is probably one of the things that I regret most, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because I've had to really do a lot of thinking the last couple of months. You know, again, I was raised to really believe that what was important was what you thought about yourself and how you measured up to the standards you set for yourself. And I think if my father and mother said anything to me more than 1,000,000 times, it was, don't listen to what other people say. Don't be guided by other people's opinions. You know, you have to live with yourself. And I think that's good advice. I mean, I'm glad I got it as a girl growing up, and I've passed it on to my daughter. But I do think that that advice and my belief in it, combined with my sense of privacy, because I do feel like I've always been a fairly private person leading a public life, led me to perhaps be less understanding than I needed to of both the press and the public's interest as well as right to know things about my husband and me.
And Mrs. Clinton also was asked whether the Whitewater affair and her investments in commodities had undercut her and her husband's attacks on the so-called greedy 1980s.
You know, I was raised to believe that every person had an obligation to take care of themselves and their family. And that meant, you know, earning an income and saving and investing. You know, I was raised by a father who had me reading the stock tables when I was a little girl and started doing that with my daughter when she was a little girl. I mean, I don't think you'll ever find anything that my husband or I said that in any way condemns the importance of making good investments and saving, or that in any way undermines what is the heart and soul of the American economy, which is risk-taking and investing in the future. What I think we were saying is that, like anything else, that can be taken to excess.
Mrs. Clinton, right toward the end, after everything was over, was asked about Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. She had held hundreds of them here at the White House, and Mrs. Clinton was asked, are you going to do the same thing? She said, not quoting exactly, but she said, sure, it was fun, and then she gave a very relieved shrug of her shoulders. I'm Jill Doherty, CNN, reporting live from the White House.
Thanks, Jill. Again, we've been reporting on a remarkable first-of-its-kind event, at least for this First Lady, news conference at the White House with Hillary Rodham Clinton. Mostly questions about Whitewater.
I don't think we've ever gotten far enough away from health care to say that we needed to get back to it. And even in the course of this news conference, as you no doubt observed, there were several questions on the subject. News has been made today by Mr. Rostenkowski by a discussion of possible taxes to pay for it. So it has been able to proceed on an independent track. It also seems to me, Peter, that this Whitewater case has gone to a certain point now with a number of independent inquiries ongoing and a welter of issues having been raised that until they are all tied up, and Mrs. Clinton didn't have the time here today to tie them all up, it's likely to be alive at some level for some time to come. It may die down considerably, barring unforeseen new disclosures, but we've said that before.
Just one, you got 15 seconds to ask this. When she talks about our inexperience in Washington and we've created confusion, are you all sympathetic to that?
Well, indeed we are, Peter, and one of the hallmarks of Bill Clinton in his political career, and perhaps of Mrs. Clinton as well, has been their ability to learn from their own mistakes. What she said were mistakes.
Okay, Britt Hume, thanks very much. See you later on World News Tonight. So there you are, a new NATO ultimatum to the Serbs, a long news conference by Mrs. Clinton. We'll have complete details on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us.
This has been a special report from ABC.
At one point in time to deal with that transaction. So this story about being passive and not knowing what was taking place in Whitewater, when indeed there was activity that went well beyond what a passive investor would, simply does not square up with the facts. She did not explain how it is that a $1,000 investment could yield profits of $5,300 on the same day. And I think there have been a number of publications. The Wall Street Journal, for example, indicated that if you put a cash deposit of $1,000 on that particular day, you would have had to churn it and had 17 contracts which would have required $22,000 to be put up in order to be able to result with that kind of profit. So I think it is important, though, that the First Lady did indicate that it's important to get the facts out. And I would hope that my colleagues in the Congress would understand the same thing, and that we would go forth with the congressional hearings in a way that would not impede the special counsel, and so that these and other questions as it relates to the independent regulators and whether or not there were others within the administration who attempted to impede that investigation, whether or not that's the case. So we will persist in this because I do believe the American people have a right to know if there has been an abuse of power.
Senator D'Amato, just returning to your first point, the First Lady spent about an hour. Many of these questions were very detailed. There were follow-ups. You don't feel that she helped clear the air at all about her involvement in Whitewater? You don't feel at all comfortable? You don't feel that she was being honest and forthcoming?
I think that there were many areas that were left absolutely with no answers, and that she may have handled this in a very calm and cool and collected way, the inquiries, but I think there still is a question as it relates to fact as opposed to fantasy. I think when you suggest $1,000 that would return $5,300 on the initial day, that we did not receive an adequate answer as it related to that. I think there were cases of convenient memory lapses as it related to various activities and who undertook them. And I believe that while the First Lady should receive credit for coming forward and attempting to answer questions that were put to her, there still are many areas, as I've indicated, and I've attempted to just touch on several of the more relevant and pertinent ones. We could go through a list, and Monday I will put out, or Tuesday, I will put out a detailed list of questions that I believe should be answered. I was going to do it on the floor of the Senate today, but I will pursue that. And indeed, one of those questions that I will be touching on is the question of whether or not the Clintons were merely passive investors, if they were. And I will tell you, I already had this prepared before. Why did Hillary Clinton take property from Whitewater and put it in her own name? Now, that took place early in the 80s. Why did Hillary Clinton borrow money in her own name to build a model home for the Whitewater Development Company? Is that the activity of a passive investor? And so you can't say on one hand I was a passive investor and had no knowledge of why it was we weren't putting up an equal sum, and on the other hand say, well, I just left this to Mr. McDougal. And we're talking about a person who said that as it related even to $1,000 that they put up, they knew every single thing that was taking place as it relates to that. And if indeed she did, and she certainly didn't adequately explain how it was, that $1,000 could result in a profit of $5,300 the next day. As a matter of fact, some of the leading authorities in the commodities area have indicated that the most one could make on that particular day, if you invested $1,000, would be $1,600. And that is if you bought a soybean contract. And so there are, again, the questions of fact and fantasy. And I think the people have a right to know, and I think it's important that the Congress, and that's what I am, I do not question the First Lady coming forward. I think she did herself a service, the American people a service, but I think the Congress has an absolute obligation then of determining the rest of these facts, and I think congressional hearings must be held to get the truth. And I don't pretend to know these answers, and that's why you have to get to them. I think the question of whether or not there was interference with the independent regulators is a very pertinent one. I think the question as how it was that these meetings were held and whether or not the president was advised of it was a pertinent one. And did he encourage other of these meetings? I think it's difficult to believe, at least for me to conceive, that on 4 occasions, the chief of staff, the council, the president's own top advisors in addition to, at least on one occasion, Mrs. Clinton's chief of staff and press people attended these meetings, and that they were not advised of them. So I think this is a question that we have to ascertain. And if they were advised of him, was there any action that was taken in addition to these meetings that we have been advised of? And I just leave you with one other thought. The only way that we ever came up with this, well, the American people and the press were made aware of these meetings that were certainly at the least improper, was as a result of a congressional hearing. That hearing didn't impede the work of the nation. I'm not looking, some have characterized this as payback. That's ridiculous. This is a mandate that we have and a responsibility. Certainly, it should not interfere with the operation of the Congress. It should not stop the government from going forward. It should not derail or delay the crime bill or welfare reform or health care. And so I think for those who raise this, this would simply be an argument that every president could then raise as it related to the question of whether or not there should be congressional hearings. Whenever that matter came up, someone can come forward and rightfully claim that they're very important issues, issues that would appear and might even be more important than the particular congressional inquiry. Does that mean then from all time hereafter there will be no congressional inquiry of the executive? Because the executive could rightfully claim there will be other very contentious matters, well, worldwide threatening, other Bosnias, unfortunately, other problems as it relates to nuclear arms and proliferation, whether it's North Korea or another area in the future with other administrations and with other presidents. Are we trying to set a policy now where we would be saying, well, to have a congressional hearing diverts us from these critical issues? And I don't think that that's what democracy is about, and I don't think that's what we should countenance. Yes?
What's the status on getting hearings on Whitewater? We've heard about Whitewater and hearings, but yet we've not heard anything about when they would be held.
Well, the two leaders have exchanged correspondence with respect to this. There is a thought that it should be a hybrid committee. There's another thought that it should be within the jurisdiction of the banking committee. I think that if it were in the jurisdiction of the banking committee, it certainly should have jurisdiction that goes beyond strictly those matters that lie within the general purview of the banking committee. Otherwise, we would not be able to ascertain important information and facts that touch on Whitewater and that might not be strictly construed as within their jurisdiction. So I think that's the question. And if you have to raise tactics, I think that's why the leadership of the Democratic Party or congressional leadership is attempting to narrow the focus, not as some have suggested, as an attempt to keep it under my jurisdiction, but rather, and I don't say in a cynical way, but rather to limit the scope by keeping it in one committee. If it were a hybrid committee, therefore, there would be no question about us looking into the question of, for example, U.S. attorneys and whether or not there was an attempt to influence them as it related to investigations that tangentially or directly touched upon Whitewater, Madison, and other matters. And so an argument to prevent that from taking place and saying, well, we'll wait for that to become up under the Judiciary Committee could be made. The question, for example, of the small business loans and the appropriateness of them. Indeed, that could take on and that could be used if you kept it just in one committee and not a hybrid committee that had members of that committee on, well, you all know what hybrid, but the fact of the matter is that that might then be used as an attempt to preclude us from examining that. Now, I say that to be instructive to some members of the press who seem to try to adopt another spin to it.
Senator?
Yeah.
Senator?
Yes.
Do you feel that because of Mrs. Clinton's involvement in Whitewater and her unanswered questions, as you put it today, that she should continue to handle her responsibility on health care, which so many people are interested in?
Well, I think that she should continue in that manner that she has already. She's obviously vigorous and knowledgeable in the pursuit of the health care reform and the goals that she and the President have outlined. I think that there is very reasonable grounds for disagreement on the implementation of some of these goals. But certainly I don't think that she should be disqualified in any way from going forward. I think that the American public, though, having nothing to do with Whitewater, have some very real concerns. I think the Congress has some very real concerns about the single-payer system and how it will be financed and what the impact will be, and that is good. But I don't believe that it has any relevance to Whitewater. I think these are legitimate concerns and very real differences, and they cut across party lines, I might add. So it's not a legislative gridlock that comes from one side as opposed to the other.
Thanks very much. Thanks,
Okay.
New York Senator Alphonse D'Amato, responding to First Lady